Well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new fantasy Christmas movie, Red One. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So, as any geek knows, back during the 1990s, there was a thing called the console wars, as several companies, really battled for supremacy in the emerging video game industry. Nintendo, they already had the reputation for the cozy aesthetics and just family-friendly stories, so their chief rival, Sega, kind of boldly sought to claim the more mature lane. With their slogan, Sega does what Nintendo don't, and they made games for the cool kids, which were sleek and edgy with a bit more violence, a bit more sex, a bit more profanity sprinkled in. And before you start thinking that perhaps you have opened the wrong review, here's the point. I think Red One to me is very much like a Sega-style Christmas movie. I think in a very increasingly crowded holiday movie genre, defined by whimsical family fare, Red One attempts to set itself apart with an edgier approach that does seem designed to appeal more to older viewers. But as gamers know, Sega ultimately lost the console wars, and unfortunately, I think the outlook for Red One doesn't look so holly jolly either. There is some silly fun and entertainment to be had with Red One, but really beyond the outer wrappings of a very convoluted story and just abominable visual effects, there's just very little Christmas spirit to be found. Because this movie, it does not abide at all by the philosophy of it's the thought that counts. Instead, like a good old-fashioned commercialized Christmas celebration, it's all about the flash and the spectacle where big is always better. Thus, Santa, he does not live in a quaint workshop, but he governs a sprawling, futuristic city. And not only does Santa himself exist in this world, but so do countless other sort of mythological beings. And really, in many ways, Red One is more like a fantasy epic wrapped in a very Yuletide aesthetic, more than it is like a traditional Christmas movie. And its PG-13 tone, like I mentioned, does seem designed to try and appeal more to teen audiences who have grown out of The Polar Express or A Muppet Christmas Carol, which PSA, you're never too old for the Muppets. But actually, at the last minute, I decided not to take my two 9-year-old boys along with me to this screening. And I'm just glad that I didn't. Red One is not necessarily this an over-the-top raunchy or offensive movie, but with frequent profanity and thong bikinis and a cynical tone and just other edgy content. It's just not a film that's specifically aimed at younger viewers. That being said, Red One is not entirely without merit. I think after all, not all Christmas stories are required by some kind of law to be cute, wholesome fairy tales. I think in a crowded genre, Red One at least aspires to offer something fresh and original. And the movie is just, it's rarely boring, which to be very clear, doesn't mean it's always enjoyable. But the story, it's very briskly paced and just kind of jumps from one spectacle to the next. I think rarely pausing long enough for audiences to stop and dwell at just sort of how disjointed the events are. And there is some amusing world building going on, and it does have a very star-studded cast, including Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Chris Evans and J.K. Simmons and Lucy Liu. Unfortunately, those positive elements in Red One aren't enough to keep this movie off of the naughty list. And to quote a very famous Christmas philosopher, maybe Christmas doesn't come from a store, maybe Christmas perhaps means a little bit more. And really everything about Red One just feels very commercial and empty. There's really an abundance of very flashy spectacle, but just very little beneath the surface. And Dwayne Johnson and Chris Evans, they do have decent chemistry together and now and then some fun banter, but just that their characterizations overlap to where both are these cynical characters who have lost the joy of Christmas. I do think casting J.K. Simmons as Santa Claus is a very inspired choice. To me, he single-handedly is responsible for really all the emotional heart, the Christmas spirit in this movie. The problem is that he is also kidnapped at the start of the film and then spends the rest of the runtime unconscious in a magical prison. And kind of as a result, the only character in this entire film who seems to find any joy in Christmas is also absent for most of its runtime. And with Red One, it really does seem like it's all spectacle for the sake of spectacle, and that wouldn't be quite as big of an issue if the visuals just didn't look so bad, almost as if the filmmaker's ambition just totally outpaced their budget for the special effects. But even beyond that, I think the bigger issue is that the plot also feels completely hollow, because the story is a convoluted jumble of just disjointed scenes that has a very MacGuffin chasing plot that seems merely to exist only to string together its various kind of disconnected action sequences. As far as language, there is one character that like begins to say the F word, but then is interrupted before fully articulating that. But it leaves no doubt like the word they were about to say. And kind of beyond that, there's just frequent, kind of more minor profanities. By my count, there's probably about 20, a bit over 20, most of which begin with the letter S. I kind of that God's name is used, I think 9 to 10 times, kind of used in vain. And there's this other sort of scattered, crude language throughout. As far as sexuality, there is a sequence that is set like, on a beach in which several women wear very like skimpy thong bikinis that leave most of their backsides visible. And in one moment, like a man sort of like gazes and lingers, looking at a woman from behind. There's another sort of like innuendo that I caught that. Where a character is describing the appearance of this giant, unhuman witch character, and he sort of cups his hands before his chest and says, and she has a giant pair of and then he says tails, but obviously the innuendo for that is very clear. And there's also just a brief scene where you see a married man who is flirting with another woman. The only other kind of content thing for this movie is just for parents who are maybe particularly sensitive to this, is that the film's like opening scene very directly addresses the Santa question, with a kid sort of discovering a closet full of hidden presents on Christmas Eve, and sort of his father left to give some sort of bumbling and like, this unconvincing explanation. As far as themes, worldview, this thing's going on beneath the surface of this. I think the Santa Claus tradition has always had a degree of like religious legalism baked into its Christmas cookie. You have a benevolent supernatural figure who has a list that sorts each person into categories of good and bad. Then he rewards or punishes, individuals accordingly. And I think Red One attempts to sort of challenge that traditional framework, because in the movie, Santa himself is uncomfortable with kind of that traditional binary appraisal of people. Kind of while everyone else in this movie seems to like be fixated on the list, Santa seems to be the only one that truly sees people as like complex individuals. He believes that even within like the jaded, cynical hearts of the adults, you can still find like the innocent child that they used to be inside if you look hard enough. And kind of in contrast to him, the film's like primary villain in this has a very like pharisaical mindset where she doesn't care about like rewarding the good people, only punishing the bad people. As a result of the very legalistic approach to Christmas, Santa's head of security, Kellum Drift, who is the character played by Dwayne Johnson, has just lost the joy of Christmas. He's become this very distracted by all the selfishness and like the greed of people, and just can't recognize like the good inside people anymore. To the point that like, initially when he encounters Jack, who is Chris Evans' character, he just kind of merely sees him as a naughty lister, and that's not worthy of like trust or respect. But Santa Claus, he's a wise guy. He has some good advice, and he does tell Callum, he says, we choose every day who we want to be. And just the idea that it's not the sort of simplistic categorizations of our past that determine who we are. It is, in fact, our choices. And while we can't undo like the naughty actions of our past, we can choose to do the right thing today. And from like a Christian worldview, obviously, in one sense, there is sort of an ultimate binary division between, believer and unbeliever, heaven and hell. But at the same time, I think in Mark 10:18, where a man calls to Jesus as good teacher, Jesus countered, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except for God alone." With the meaning being that at like a spiritual level, we all belong on the naughty list, and really no number of just good deeds can get our names removed. I think kind of in that way, I think Red One does echo some biblical truth that we are not divided just between like a binary of good and bad people, but between like bad people who have experienced God's love and grace, and then bad people who have not yet sort of embraced that liberating gift. So in the end, I think enjoyment of Red One may depend on like how high or how low your expectations are this Christmas. The movie does very much drive its magical reindeer-pulled sleigh like right along the line between like dumb fun and just plain dumb. I think, is it humorous at times? Sure, there are some funny moments in this, entertaining moments. Is it also just a barrage of heavy spectacle that seems more interested in having The Rock fight CGI snowmen than it is in like developing its characters or themes? Absolutely. I think viewers that are looking for something different, than just yet another iteration of Dickens' A Christmas Carol, for them, this might scratch that itch. But I think without any real emotional heart or deeper meaning, Red One is just not a very like Christmassy Christmas movie. I think without that nostalgia and charm, all that's left is just a mostly joyless action flick. But hey, I would love to hear a thought if you're less of a Scrooge and Grinch than I am and you enjoyed this movie, or hey, maybe you were, as unimpressed as I was. Don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Get lots of other movie reviews. Got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. Most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through the world for Christ.